Thank you all.
This is the first of our authors' corners, and we have three very interesting, apparently seemingly unrelated books to discuss. So hold your horses. We will start with Vikram's bestseller, Savarkar, and then we move on to Pallavi and Kabir's books. The bios, the details about the books are all there in the program, so I'll not go there. I think it's important to take this conversation forward. Welcome. Thank you. Welcome to Raisina Dialogue, to this platform.
But hopefully, the idea is to look at some of the broader trends, perhaps, for India, for the world, and how they intersect with each other. And in the realm of ideas, how we are defining India and what constitutes India and the policy problems that confront India. You and Pallavi's book actually deal with the state making in India, which is not that very different. And I think Kabir's book deals with what happens when that state building capacity perhaps weakens in some cases, or ideational constructs become more global in nature. So we will come to ISIS in the end. First of all, I must say that I must thank you for writing the book, because I think the way we are taught history, and I think you also mentioned it in your book, the first experience is that certain characters are missing. And especially now when you look back and when you look at contemporary India and you see the impact of those individuals on contemporary political discourse, and you go back to what you were taught or how you were taught and your categorizations of history, those missing elements, get in some ways bigger, and the fault lines become much more stronger. So my question to you, I won't ask you why you did the book, because at one point you mentioned the fact that Mani Shankar Iyer and how he removed the plaque from the cellular jail perhaps drove you into investigating actually what this person and his ideas mean for India and Indian nationhood. But I would just ask a broader question is, do you think Savarkar has been misunderstood? Or is it something more deliberate, that you have a certain idea, a certain construct about how we think of ourselves as Indians, and that idea seems to have become instrumental in the way we have taken on some actors and discarded others? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. A very good evening, and thank you for coming after dinner and at this hour to discuss such heavy topics of history and Pakistan and ISIS and so on. So I really compliment everyone who's here. That's a very interesting question, because I don't know, I'm sure the audience would also agree, that I don't know any other character of the past, particularly of the freedom struggle, who probably intrudes our, as you mentioned, our modern contemporary political discourse in the manner that Savarkar does. Just last week, you had some Seva Dal pamphlet against him. During the Maharashtra elections, you had this clamor for a Bharat Ratna for him. And all the time, and in the Delhi University, you had his bust being blackened by the NSUI activists. So all the time, this is one figure who intrudes our discourse. But then as a historian, when I went back to see what is it about him that is written in a modern perspective, it's quite alarming for me to inform that the last biography of his was written way back in the 1960s, by this man called Dhananjay Keer. So on the one hand, he polarizes opinion so much, but neither his proponents, and I think on both sides, when you say misunderstood, neither his proponents or his opponents have managed to research the man in a dispassionate, modern, objective way. And as you mentioned, every now and then we have biographies, and probably rightly so, of Gandhi, Nehru, and other protagonists of the freedom struggle. But then here is a man who probably, captures primetime media bites and political rallies so much more than all of the others. But still, there's an alarming lack of inquisitiveness about what did he stand for. And certainly, the misunderstanding stems from at various levels. Very few people know that he was perhaps the person who started the first organized secret society in this country. As a student, someone who organized the first student bonfire, against foreign clothes. We always associate bonfires with Gandhi and the whole Congress movement, for which he even paid a prize and got rusticated from college. Someone who was like the kingpin of the revolutionary movement in London in the 5 years that he was there, with several other protagonists of the freedom struggle. Shyamji Krishnavarma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer, none of whose names I remember ever, reading about in my NCERT history textbook, or even if I did, they were perhaps a footnote somewhere. And we were discussing just before the session began, his role in caste amelioration, and that's something which would come as a surprise, because the normal stereotype is anybody who propagated Hindutva would be someone who is a Manuvadi, who's probably sticking to the hierarchies of caste. But here was someone for 13 years who did an enormous social laboratory experiment in Ratnagiri, where he was confined, and tried his best to ensure a complete eradication of all the evils that Hindu society was facing. Of course, and the kind of tortures that he faced for 11 years in Kalapani, in cellular jail in the Andamans, where he was incarcerated. These two have very few parallels among other heroes and heroines of our freedom struggle. So there's so many things about him, and myths and assumptions, again, on both those who are on his side, and perhaps more on those who are against him, who calumnize on the basis of very little historical documentation, which I as a historian managed to unearth. And I was quite both alarmed and disturbed by what I saw. And I think this has been a bane of our historical narrative, particularly when it comes to the freedom struggle, where we have a very simplistic, linear, monochromatic narrative of a non-violent struggle. Of course, that was the mainstream of our freedom struggle, but all through, right from 1857, the first war of independence, till 1946, the naval mutiny in Bombay by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA, there was an uninterrupted chain of armed conflict also. So where is that history that is being told to the young people today? Why is it that there is only one narrative that is pushed through, indoctrinated generations after generations? If you have to amplify one, it need not be at the expense of something else, or at the cost of suppression. Revolutionaries are just shown, as these random acts of bravery by some hot-blooded young men, and they got executed for that. But revolutionary movement and armed struggle was a lot more than that, as I discovered, much to my own amazement, in the course of this book.
And I think that's why I would certainly like to thank you, because I think on the right, there is this narrative that, look, right does not do intellectual history well. Where is right's intellectual history? And you go to, there are very few good books on books of global standards, where you can go and actually dig out archival work and make an honest assessment, put the facts before the reader to make the judgment, rather than driving a certain ideological agenda. So I think that perhaps your book does extremely well. So congratulations for that, and I think hopefully this will generate a sort of renaissance.
Can I just say one thing? I wouldn't even want to classify myself as a right historian or whatever that is. A right historian in the terms not ideologically, but saying the right things maybe. But then, across the world, having a conservative view in academics, whether, from Neil Ferguson and anyone else, this is a very legitimate stand to take, in academics. Of course, even there, as Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times, even outside in the US, the so-called left liberal view kind of smothers any kind of dissent or any kind of differing opinion when it comes to academia. He writes about it in one of the articles in the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof. But I think the problem in Indian historiography is so much more than that, because the thraldom with which I think Indian history writing has been kept under, particularly from the 1970s with the establishment of the ICHR, careers have been destroyed of people who had a viewpoint that was different from the mainstream. And I find it quite a dichotomy to call that as a liberal historiography, because it is anything but liberal.
Illiberalism of the liberals, but I think that's it's a fair question to ask when you now have conservative viewpoints becoming so prominent in this country in politics, in culture, and that is where the center of power in fact lies. And I would invite you to talk a bit about the idea of Hindutva or multiple ideas of Hindutva. And where does Savarkar intersect, for example, with RSS, with even with Gandhi, because Gandhi's own idea of Hindutva was a certain kind, had a certain he came from a certain vantage point on this. And also perhaps talk about Ambedkar, if you don't mind, because these are multiple sources of cultural heritage that we have, and we don't seem to be having a conversation that there is certainly something even the idea of Hindutva has multiple genesis. There are multiple vantage points that we can look at it from, and perhaps where does Savarkar would fit in when you look at RSS today becoming the most dominant political or social force in this country?
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, Savarkar was never a part of the RSS all his life, and he actually quite looked down upon the RSS. His elder brother, Baba Rao, was one of the founding members of the RSS, along with Hedgewar. But then this man was never a part of it, and I think it was competing constituencies of the same Hindu community, just like probably what the BJP and Shiv Sena have to compete with each other. So he was always with the Hindu Mahasabha. Now this treatise, Essentials of Hindutva, which he wrote right from the confines of Ratnagiri prison in 1923, a very slim volume, which I always say it was his first intellectual salvo against Gandhi, with whom he had a running feud, ideological feud all his life. And the context in which this particular booklet came into being was the Khilafat movement, which, I mean, there's discussion on ISIS, and I personally hold the view that pandering to this pan-Islamist, tendencies right from that time, I think that is what sowed the real seeds of partition and separatism in this country, where you are actually instigating a community on religious lines to fight for the cause of some sultanate which is sitting thousands of kilometers away in Turkey, and mobilizing them on communal basis, and also promising them the unthinkable, that within 1 year you're going to get Swaraj for the country, and within 1 year you're going to also establish a Khilafat in Turkey, which Britain had actually won in war. And there was no reason they would have to oblige a colony, a slave nation, to actually, accede to those demands. So the repercussions of that were large-scale communal riots across India in the 1920s, the Mopla carnage in, Malabar, in different parts of India. And every time the response of Gandhi particularly and of the Congress was very pusillanimous. And I think there was a need for someone to give that intellectual counter to that, and that is precisely what Savarkar did, where he defined a Hindu not in terms of the theological aspects of the religion, but as a cultural and a nationalistic identity marker, saying you can have your diversities when it comes to religion, language, culture, and so on, but then your allegiance needs to be to this landmass, with his famous Sanskrit couplet that he had, that anybody who lives within this landmass between the Indus and the oceans, who considers this land as the land of his ancestors, and also as a holy land, not in terms of religion, but in terms of allegiance, that person is a Hindu, again, not by means of a religion, but again as a cultural marker. And this concept keeps developing through the ages. And when he was the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, particularly in his Hindu Rashtra Darshan, where he talks about what is his concept of a Hindu Rashtra, he says, I envisage a Hindu Rashtra where all religions, there's no discrimination against anybody on the basis of caste, religion, gender, community, any of those. And nobody is, everybody is free, equal in the eyes of the law. The majority community is not going to get any excess privileges only because it has more numbers, and on the converse, even the minority is not going to get concessions just because you are a minority. Now, even if the government needs to step in and aid religious institutions, madrasas, temples, or whatever, you can give the money, but that money that they give needs to be in proportion of the tax that community pays. I mean, this was a very utilitarian, very economic, emotional, very rational kind of a view. And his views, when I read them, I mean, they were far ahead of his times, is what I would say. And that is one reason perhaps why he did not become so popular then. This man was a nihilist, someone who asked for a complete dismantling of society, complete dismantling of the caste system, someone who didn't believe that the cow was a animal that was worthy of worship. It's just
interesting in today's context,
in today's times, where he says, if you want to worship it in your house, you can do it, but then elevating an animal which stands in its own excreta to the level of a goddess is, it's an insult both to humanity and divinity and so on. So on all these these aspects, there was a lot of friction between the Hindutva, which the RSS then, which was more an orthodox, upper caste, Maharashtrian, unit, not so much now, but then a lot more like that. They had these areas of differences. Intercaste marriage, intercaste dining. He sets up the first temple in 1931 in Ratnagiri called the Patit Pavan Mandir, where people of all communities are allowed entry. Someone who says the Vedas are not the preserve of only one community or caste. It is universal knowledge, so everybody can read that. So obviously, he being a Chitpavan Brahmin himself, someone who was dismantling social structures in this way, obviously his version of Hindutva was not acceptable even to the main votaries of Hindutva, which later became the RSS. And there was
that's not very conservative either. I mean, conservatives traditionally would not dismantle the system.
Exactly. And and when I look at some of the views that, especially on caste, between him and Ambedkar, there's a lot of consonance. There's a lot of convergence of views, and the two of them came from the same milieu, the same state. And Ambedkar, they never met, but then Ambedkar, lots of his laudatory letters are there, because he writes to Savarkar saying, "You're the only one who has understood that taking away the Chatur Varna system, the four Varnas, is the only way that Hindu society can be reformed. Nobody else has understood it." And he said that in the context at a time when Gandhi, when a group of untouchables go to him in 1932, he tells them, "I believe in the Varna system, because everybody cannot become a prime minister or a viceroy. It has to come through your genes. Leadership also comes through your genes. It's not something that you can do through meritocracy." So these competing ideas of India, as there's no one idea of India, but multiple ideas of India, are something that today, I think after 7 decades of freedom, I think we can sit and dispassionately analyze what was each person's viewpoint and how did each of that contribute to that narrative. And a composite of all of that is what I think has led to the India of today.
But Vikram, the main fault line, of course, was between Gandhi and Savarkar. And in some ways, that is also shaping the contemporary political discourse when it comes to, for example, Congress Party's attitude towards Savarkar. And there is a lot of discussion around, of course, I don't think you will be dealing with the Gandhi assassination episode in your sequel. But that question where how do you look at Gandhi at a time where Gandhi himself is also partly being appropriated by the BJP. He is the sort of the great biggest figure in many ways, which all political parties want a part of for various reasons, instrumental or otherwise. But I think when it comes to Savarkar, therefore, the debate becomes very difficult, because then the Congress, and you have the other liberals who have left, who has accused Savarkar of being part of the assassination, the whole ideas that drove Godse to do certain things. So what is, you don't have to reveal much, but as you look to the next sequel, and as you look to this relationship between Gandhi and Savarkar, and as you look at the Indian political discourse today, are there points of convergence here, or are these two very, very diametrically opposite personalities that perhaps would running parallel and never meeting?
I don't think these two thoughts, these two ideas of India could ever meet. And quite symbolically, their portraits hang diagonally opposite to each other in the Central Hall of Parliament. And I think that's what it is, and it's fine. It's fine to have a dominant view. It's fine to have a counter narrative. And all through his life, as I said, right from the first time they met in 1906 in London as a young student in India House, there was no way these two men could think alike on any issue, be it their approach to freedom itself. One believed in a non-violent movement. The other was a great votary of a violent struggle, drawing from Italian revolutionaries like Mazzini and Garibaldi, and having all these secret societies, organized secret societies, and so on. And as time progressed, I think the differences just grew with, as I said, Gandhi's views on caste, Gandhi's views on Hindu-Muslim relations, which Savarkar and people like him found it as blatant appeasement, and which probably also led to, as I said, sowing the seeds of partition. We were having a conversation about him being virulently anti-Muslim, but then I would urge people to actually read perhaps what Ambedkar has had to write too about the Muslim sentiment of the time, in his thoughts on Pakistan and the partition of India. I think what Savarkar has written pales in comparison, because I think that was the mood of the time. There was a certain idea that was prevalent, and partition was knocking on the at the door. So I mean, people responded as a product of their circumstances. Today, to extrapolate that and take out a few elements, I think that would be very disingenuous. But coming to the contemporary political discourse, right in the 1970s, when Savarkar died, you had none less than the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who issued such a laudatory message, saying here is a man whose name was a very byword for patriotism, sacrifice and courage, and also issues a stamp in his honor. She also gives money for a memorial for him, and also gets a documentary film done by the INB ministry sanctioned. So what happened in the 1970s? Didn't Indira Gandhi know that this man was a coward, was a Gandhi murderer, was a collaborator of the British, was the stooge? So today her grandson sings a different tune, and I think the only reason is highly political expediency, because in the 1970s Hindutva was not a force to reckon with politically, whereas today it is. And quite mistakenly people think that to get to the current dispensation, the best way to do that is to attack their so-called ideological father, which is Savarkar, and then also malign, saying, you really never had any role to play in the freedom struggle. Almost assuming that there was only one kind of freedom struggle that was going on, as I mentioned right at the start. And you had none less than the leader of opposition, the former leader of opposition in the Lok Sabha, saying even your dogs did not participate, in the freedom struggle. So the whole idea is, we are the rightful heirs to this throne, and anybody else who's coming here is a usurper. You have not contributed anything to this country. And I think that narrative has stuck, and it has been reinforced over several decades. And I think 2 generations have been indoctrinated with this viewpoint.
Very briefly, we have very limited time left. Two questions which I want to raise. One is, of course, this whole issue of petitions, and whether it
never be brief.
But for that, people will read the book. Again, but this is something that you mentioned, and it is also being used now. That he was a traitor, and therefore why to talk about him, or why to look at him in a way which perhaps acknowledges his contribution to the freedom struggle. So if you can briefly dwell upon whether that fault line will remain a political fault line in the country, given that that's where the other side is coming from, and to target, as you say, to target the BJP today. The other is, of course, very briefly again, and I'm getting the signal that we have to wrap up.
Right.
The whole idea, when you look at India today, would you say that the idea of Savarkar, or Savarkar's idea of India, is the one that is becoming prominent in some ways? Again, there are fault lines there as well, the cow issue notwithstanding. But how do you evaluate contemporary India when you look at this intellectual history of Savarkar and take it forward?
Right. So on the petition thing, I think it's a total misconception where, it was a very normal, legal agency that everyone had, all political prisoners. It was not only him who was given this special privilege of filing a petition, and people call it a mercy petition. I don't call it a mercy petition. It's just a petition, a yachika, which people could put. And he was a lawyer. He was also acting as a spokesperson for all the other political prisoners. His 1917 petition, for instance, and in my book, I have actually put all the petitions in toto, so that people can read where is the apology being asked in that. It was only, consistently being said, clarify our position. Are we a political prisoner? Are we a common convict? What is it? And accordingly give us our privileges. In the 1917 petition, for instance, he says, if my name constitutes an obstacle in the release of all the other prisoners, kindly delete my name and release all the others, and that would give me as much pleasure as my own release would secure. So was that a stooge talking? Was that someone who was trying to secure his release at any aspect? And none less than Gandhi in 1920, when Savarkar's younger brother approaches him and asks him for help, Gandhi himself, advises him, ask your brother to file a petition to the British, and I will also file a petition on his behalf, and he actually does that. So if petitioning was such a bad word, then I don't think, then Gandhi would also be accused of petitioning people. So many others, you had Sachindranath Sanyal who filed petitions and got out. You had Barin Ghosh. You had later even petitions were filed on behalf of the Kakori case convicts, Ram Prasad Bismil, Ashfaqullah, and others. So at some point, we need to understand that this is a dead horse that has been flogged for way too long. And the legalese of that does not, rhetorically, for political reasons, you can do what you want, but then legally it stands very little water. Now, to your second question, that's very elaborate, and I don't know how to answer it briefly. But I think a lot of aspects of what Savarkar envisaged, which is a strong nation, a militaristic nation, a nationalistic nation, which has its pros and cons today, as we are seeing, is materializing. His approach, as I said, was not a non-violent struggle. Gandhi had asked for a dismantling of the Indian army in 1947, but he always stood for a militarized country, and maybe after Pokhran we've become one of the strongest military nations of the world. In terms of economic policy too, he was consistently against the idea of Gram Swaraj and this whole charkha, which he found was foolish. And he said beyond symbolism there is nothing much. It stood for industrialization and the mechanization, use of machines, and the industrial revolution that was brought in Europe. So on those fronts, then on diplomacy, foreign policy, everywhere where nation first kind of an approach, which he's espoused time and time again in his writings. So I think somewhere, and as I said, this justice to all communities, and you can't have a nation within a nation, and whatever you accuse the Indian political right of their omissions and commissions, one thing that has been consistent is this whole idea that you cannot ek nishan, ek vidhan, ek samvidhan, you can't have a nation within a nation. Savarkar, his protege Shama Prasad Mukherjee and others gave his life for the cause of abrogation of Article 370. Now today we are seeing all that happening, abolition of triple talaq, whether it was Balakot, where his book is also called Shatruncha Shibirat, inside the enemy camp. You're not going to send olives to the enemy if the enemy doesn't listen to you. You're going to enter the enemy camp and hurt where it hurts most. So I think that's exactly what that somewhere that muscular policy is emanating from this. Now, how much of that is good for the country, how to tone it down, how to ensure it doesn't cause social unrest and friction like what we are seeing today, I think that is different. But somewhere ideologically, it does stem from some of these writings. A lot of his other views, liberal views, be it on cow, on caste, and so on, is unfortunately not even probably acknowledged even by the Indian political right.
So thank you, Vikram. That was wonderful, and I'm sure
Thank
many
you.
of you have read his
Thank
book.
you.
Please buy more. Those of you who have not, it's worth reading. More power to you, and hopefully we'll read the sequel very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can I now invite Pallavi Raghavan? So we will talk about all of these things when it comes to your book. Your book is not out in the Indian market yet, is it?
It's not out. It'll be out at the end of February. It'll be out at the end of February from HarperCollins, and it's out from OUP, New York, and Hearst, UK at the end of this month.
So it's called Animosity at Bay, and an alternative history of the India-Pakistan relationship, 1947 to 1952. We were just discussing, just on methodology first, which I'm sure very few people would be interested in, but it's very, very nice to see a new generation of scholars coming out in India, using archives more and trying to dig deep into our history, not doing more of the reductive work that sometimes has compromised a lot of our conversations. And both of your books, Vikram's and yours, deal with a lot of the archival data, empirical. So it's great to see that happening. Do you see that shift when you teach at Ashoka? You see you deal with a lot of. I think you have dealt also with Jindal. You're part of a historical society of scholars, historians in India who are doing contemporary India. Do you see a shift there in terms of methodologies that younger scholars are employing or perhaps are being trained into?
Yeah, I think there's this definite kind of archival turn in the study of India's foreign policy and in the study of India's IR. And I thought I'd start by saying that, it's almost like a truism these days to sort of say that, the problem in the study of India's IR is that South Asian states they don't fit in with traditional definition of Westphalian state behavior, and they're not organized along the lines of they simply don't adhere to the norms of Westphalian kind of states. And, and there's a reason that the discipline of India, IR doesn't work in India is because the kind of yardsticks or the norms or the or the rules that you use to kind of judge how a state behaves in the way that it is are so influenced by Westphalian kind of standards. And I think it's partly a reaction to that there's a sense that you have to kind of delve into Indian South Asian traditions or local traditions, and think of how the state kind of evolved from those sorts of traditions, and evaluate the making of the state, or the the evolution of the state in terms of a more kind of localized historical tradition. And one of the arguments that this book is trying to kind of put forward is that it's partition. I mean, this book is a history book. It's about partition.
And that's where I wanted to come. And why do you call it an alternative history?
So it's a history.
Just for this audience, if you can give them a sense of book's main arguments and.
Yeah, so the book is about the early diplomatic history between India and Pakistan from 1947 to 1952, and it's about how the aftermath of partition affected the way in which India's and Pakistan's early international relations were forged. And it's about how the foreign ministries of India and Pakistan were forged in the shadow of the aftermath of partition, and how their positions vis-a-vis one another were affected as a consequence of the implementation of the consequences of partition, including issues like the enormous influx of refugees, of minorities, of evacuee property, of the division of assets, of the the delineation of the boundary line, of water. And it's about how these issues that kind of emerged out of the consequence of partition shaped the way in which the mold of of diplomatic relationship between India and Pakistan was cast. And what it's trying to argue is that on all these questions, there was, in fact, we think of India-Pakistan relations as this field that is kind of doomed to enmity right from the start. And that it was always, it was kind of like a knee-jerk, automatic, predicted from the beginning, inevitable that India and Pakistan would have a relation, would have a enmity, and that that it was inevitable from the beginning that there would be a animosity between them. And what this book is trying to bring out is that on a variety of issues like the ones I just outlined, which at the time were considered just as fraught as the Kashmir question, on evacuee property, for example, or on water, these were very, very live, very, very kind of volatile political questions, which frequently brought the newspapers to kind of declaring that, that this is it, now India and Pakistan are going to war. So on all these other questions, there was in fact a surprising degree of cooperation and collaboration and coordination between the two governments of India and Pakistan. And what kind of animated the dialogue between these two governments at this stage was a kind of pragmatic spirit of cooperation, of getting the partition done, and arriving at terms which would, arriving at terms of settlement for the partition, and kind of, and cooperating on that basis. And what didn't characterize these discussions was a sense of inevitable enmity, or was a sense of predestined, kind of volatility or hostility. So it's the reason I'm calling it an alternative history is because I'm trying to track this type of dialogue, this type of pragmatic cooperation of setting the terms of partition and getting, and getting over with the partition. I'm trying to track how that, that conversation was had in the shaping of India-Pakistan relationship. And that type of cooperation hasn't, in the literature so far, been addressed adequately, and it hasn't been integrated into a great deal of the literature that forms the analysis of the India-Pakistan dynamic.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a political scientist, and so we have these iconic books on India-Pakistan which have sort of defined the field. They mostly talk of security dilemmas, the identity question, the culture question, the institutional question. Why did India and Pakistan take two different routes to certain kind of political institutionalization? And you sort of take them on and in a way react to them, arguing that perhaps a different reading is possible of the times. And two, I think, chapters which also have some very contemporary relevance, the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, as well as the Indus Waters, which we keep hearing again and again. There's it is being used occasionally as a tool of diplomacy, both coercive and benevolent, I would argue. And you drive down deep into the sources of these conversations as they emerged in the 40s and 50s. So can you tell us a bit about them and how when you see the conversations today about these similar things, how would you react?
Yeah, so the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, I mean, I was saying earlier before the session started that, I couldn't, cynically speaking, like I couldn't have asked for a better kind of circumstance for for the release of my book, because it's suddenly in the papers again. And not necessarily, understood correctly. So I'm glad that the book kind of gives an opportunity to contextualize the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, and which was signed between the two prime ministers, Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan, in Delhi in April 1950, in response to an enormous refugee crisis that had threatened to bring India and Pakistan to the brink of war in the closing months of 1949. And what had also happened, what happens during these during the refugee crises is that this was also dangerous politically for the stability of the governments of Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan, both of whom were getting kind of complaints from these very, very, very powerful provincial chief ministers, saying that, look, we're inundated by these thousands and thousands and millions of refugees across the eastern basin, and either do something to stop them from coming or take a strong stance against the other, or give us more money to rehabilitate them, because we're in no position to be able to feed so many millions of people. And if you don't do either of these things, then we can make it very difficult for the political survival of your government. So it's, in a sense, it forged a basis of commonality between Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan to come to some kind of settlement to address this problem. And so this pact is signed between between these two prime ministers in 1950. And one of the other things that's also worth bearing in mind is that a lot of the terms in the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, the clauses of the pact, actually borrow to a surprising degree. I mean, actually borrow to a surprising degree from norms that had been set in interwar Europe as a consequence of the breakup of large multinational, multi-ethnic empires along ethnic majoritarian lines, which and the forging of new nation states and the redrawing of their boundary lines. And the question that posed was, okay, fine, what do you do when you redraw these boundary lines? What do you do with the minorities that are left behind? What the Nehru-Liaquat Pact had stipulated was that the government of India and Pakistan would be legally accountable to one another for the welfare of minorities inside their boundaries, and that so the government of Pakistan, if there was an instance of minority discrimination in East Bengal, the government of the Deputy High Commissioner of India would be legally accountable to go to the government of Pakistan and ask for something to be done, and the government of Pakistan would be legally accountable to give answers, to give redressal to these complaints, and vice versa. Now, this type of arrangement was actually initially, set in place by the League of Nations in interwar Europe, which had said that, okay, when these multinational, multi-ethnic empires are getting broken up along the lines of, ethno-majoritarian nation states, then in the case of minority discrimination, what the League of Nations provided for was that a concerned nation could take up a cause on the behalf of a minority, outside its boundaries, and go to the League of Nations and ask for redressal. And then the League of Nations was legally required to go, it was legally empowered to act on behalf of this minority and go to the responsible state and ask for something to be done. So, in a sense, what the book is arguing is that you're seeing how India and Pakistan, when they're trying to disentangle the complexities of partition, they're trying to follow norms, they're trying to follow norms set by Western and Eastern European nation states in the interwar period. And they're trying to grapple with the partition, and they're trying to forge their own bilateral relationship in ways that are influenced by these norms.
So when you look at this discussion today on the pact is being cited by both sides, do you see an evolution in the identity of both nations in along certain trajectories that allows us now to have a very different set of conversations about the same problem today than perhaps was happening when the account of which you have produced in your book? Because that's a larger question I have, that identities also change over time, right? They're not stuck in time. So as India, Pakistan mutually constituted each other's identity, as you point out in your book, Pakistan's identity also underwent a transformation after 1952, for example. Right. So you had a host of factors. Geopolitics can be one. Domestic transformation, domestic upheavals, military entry of the military in a certain direction. Islamicism. So again, the whole debate about what Pakistan is today, and because you raise this point in the end that this also can become a prism for evaluating India-Pakistan relations of today. So therefore, the question would be that can we use this subtext to evaluate contemporary India-Pakistan relations, or you will have to work on a different set of arguments post-1952 and then come to a different set of conclusions?
Yeah, so what the book is, and the book is a history book. It's a partition book. I'm a historian by training. All my degrees are in history. I happen to be in the IR department, so but it's a history book, and it's looking at things that happened in 1950. But what the book is saying though is that the thing that the Nehru-Liaquat Pact was predicated on, and the acts of cooperation that did work between India and Pakistan, what they were predicated on, was that that there was a sense of reciprocity, and that they were mutually constituted, and that all decision making that the governments did had to be done in a kind of consultation with one another. And what made the Nehru-Liaquat Pact tick was that this wasn't a unilateral action. It was, the government of Pakistan was legally accountable to the government of India over its minorities and vice versa. The logic of the pact was to make sure that the minorities stayed where they were, and the reassurance that was given to them was that, that the reason you'll be secure is because we've got a reciprocal pact in place. So it's this kind of and what the book is trying to argue is that this kind of calculation in the shaping of bilateral relations. Now my book stops at 1952. But what I would like to read more about is, when does this kind of imperative feature again in the future relationship between India and Pakistan? And it's speculative. I haven't written it. It stops at 1952. But my feeling is that it does feature again in the history of the relationship in the decades that followed, and that there are. Along with the many acts of warfare and hostility and animosity and volatility, there's also a surprising trajectory of cooperation and dialogue which is premised on this understanding that the partition and the security of the states of India and Pakistan have to be mutually constituted.
But Pallavi, because you have written a book on India and Pakistan, you cannot get away by saying that you are a historian. You have to tell us what should be India's policy towards Pakistan. I'm just kidding, you don't have to. But thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
All the best for the book. So, from India, Pakistan, now to the rise of ISIS. Our very own Kabir Taneja. Kabir, welcome. He's a bestseller now. His book is riding on the back of ISIS and its peril. And it has done very well in the Indian market. I'm told it's in the second edition or is already underway.
Soon, yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
So, we were having this discussion about history and how it impacts the way we look at some of the contemporary policy issues. But here is something which, Vikram mentioned, the idea of pan-Islamism and how that has shaped India's history, also the history of the subcontinent. And here you're looking at a phenomena that is as pan-Islamist as it can be, and its impact. You're looking in particular at the impact of the rise of ISIS on South Asia and India. When you look at the policy landscape today, when you look at this question, what are 2 or 3 things that you would tell us about ISIS right now? That is what in the context of what is happening in the Middle East. That should make us sit up and take notice that this phenomena is still there, that we have to be worried about it, and not be complacent about some of what has happened on the ground at the moment.
Right. In the current situation in the Middle East, I don't think it's as worrying as it was during the period of 2014-15. That was when the Syrian civil war was creating a lot of political vacuum in the region, where all these actors were able to install themselves, and for various reasons, for fighting against President Bashar al-Assad, or for the Shiite militias had different plans. Al-Qaeda also moved in. So it was that war against the Syrian state was creating a lot of political vacuum, which led to a lot of geographical vacuum where all these actors sort of moved in. But I think one of the things that happened in 2014, and it was a pivotal moment. Islamic State as a group with its ideology is not something that's new. What it propagated and what it offered to the people who wanted to follow it is again not new. It was something that Al-Qaeda also offered. But the method in which they recruited, the kind of offerings that they made was quite different.
So what made brand ISIS so different from brand Al-Qaeda?
I think it was...
And what makes it so attractive and alluring to a large part of the population?
Yeah, but you know what? I think predominantly, of course, there's a lot of narratives where social media is seen as a catalyst, right? The branding of Islamic State and the reach that social media and the internet generally gave to the message that they wanted to spread was in their favor. But I think that the real sort of brand was the geography that they controlled. Because that's one thing. There was, of course, the foreign fighters that traveled to the Islamic State during the period of 2013 to 15 ranged from countries as far as Trinidad and Tobago on that side and Australia on this side and everything in between. The numbers may be significantly low according to countries, but France had a few hundred, Belgium had a few hundred, and so on and so forth. But the kind of packaging that geography offered was something that Al-Qaeda had not offered before. Al-Qaeda was much more structured. They had particular aims. The aims were fairly narrow. They were very hierarchical. And that is actually where Islamic State came from. Islamic State, before what ISIS was or what Islamic State became, was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the leaders at that time of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who were in constant touch with Al-Qaeda Central, which is Osama bin Laden and his immediate cohorts, thought that Al-Qaeda is, again, too structured. It is too slow. It is very bureaucratic. It is not fighting for the larger cause, which is the caliphate, fast enough. So they're too fixated on, let's say, anti-Americanism, anti-Israel, in the Middle East specifically, and so on and so forth. So it was actually the geography. If you see a lot of ISIS propaganda, and I've seen hundreds of hours, and ORF should really pay for therapy at some point, but it's always selling the land, right? So even if you see in Indian cases, in the pro-ISIS cases, we haven't had many. It's around, according to Home Ministry, it's 155. According to our data at ORF, it's 182. But in a lot of these cases, which the book actually goes into, the people who actually moved towards this ideology, first and foremost wanted to go and live in the geography. They were not that interested in committing attacks in New Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore or whatever it is. They wanted to travel. And once that didn't happen, for various reasons, that can be financial, that can be paperwork, no passports in most cases. So bureaucracy was an oddly,
roundabout way helped us.
Yeah, exactly. So, and after that, they realized that that movement is not going to happen, that they're not going to get up and travel to Syria or Iraq or, to fight for Islamic State. Their interest dropped sharply. And they, in many cases, just went back to their normal lives. And it only later on came up that they were, okay, still talking about Islamic State on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it was, that when the police finally acted upon. And of course, India came very late to the game of realizing the role that internet played in this new sort of sphere.
But see, that's a paradox, right? If we believe the argument that you are making, that look, geography was such an important factor, with the geographical decimation of the group at the moment, we can reasonably conclude that perhaps the situation is going down, as you're pointing out, that its situation is not so bad as it was in 2014-15. But then you also have the argument that, look, the ideational underpinnings of this group or what it purports or wants to do, they remain where they are. And they are equally powerful. Social media and the means of transmission that we have are equally powerful. So how do we evaluate, if you are a policymaker, how would you evaluate the challenge from and the opportunity that has arisen by the geographic decimation of this group versus the challenge that is still it continues to pose in the ideation?
Yeah, so I mean, that coming back to the point that I was making, the ideology part is not new here, right? The way that the ideology is marketed along with geography was the new part, and the methods that it was done in a very targeted manner. So even if you see a lot of cases that were being done by this fellow called Yusuf al-Hindi, who was an Indian Mujahideen person, went to Afghanistan and then died in Syria eventually. But he all spent a lot of time trying to cultivate a local ecosystem in India as well of Islamic State fighters, people who showed interest online on Facebook specifically, and then wanted to be a formally part of it, and failed drastically. And why failed? Mostly because after a point when they realized, okay, fine, ideology is well and good. We believe in what the Islamic State is saying. We believe in what they're selling to us. Ultimately, if I can't go and live in what they have to offer, I can't fight for them on the ground, I can't be part of their military, the official systems. You have to realize that they created an official system, that there was a military, they were taxing people, there was a local government, Sharia law was enforced in a lot of cities and towns. And they wanted to be part of that. Experience, of course. At some level, I think beyond ideology as well, a lot of people just fell for the frills of it. Right, there was a lot of people, there were a couple of cases at least that came out where ideology played second fiddle to just going there, having a gun and roaming around. Yeah, it sounds odd. You want to believe that it's always ideology. You want to believe that. But in a lot of Islamic State cases, unlike Al-Qaeda, where ideology was supreme in most cases, in a lot of Islamic State cases, and not just Indian cases, but beyond as well, it was the thrill as well of just being in that sort of ecosystem where you could just reign free or feel like a king for a day or whatever they were looking for was available to them.
So in India, are we being complacent about the threat, or is it really the case, as I think we know the numbers are quite low, and we have been relatively successful? Is it that we are good at it, or we are doing our job, or the policymakers are doing their job well, or is it just a sheer stroke of luck?
So, I think Indian policymakers woke up to the threat fairly late, right? It's very difficult to, even the best countries with the best security ecosystems and the most money and the biggest militaries were failing to deal with this, right? What was Islamic State doing at that point of time? That they were trying to weaponize the same communication systems that we use to talk to our families and friends, whether that be Twitter in the beginning, and then and more sort of other apps that are end-to-end encrypted, which are difficult to crack by security agencies as well, Telegram, and so on and so forth. That they were using these modern communication systems to spread their information, to spread their welcome cards, the invitation cards that people needed. And one thing that they did very well, which again we woke up fairly late to, is that the Islamic State, in a very cunning manner, released diktats, so official diktats, which said that people who spread online propaganda and recruit people online who are pro-Islamic State people get the same sort of respect and level in the Islamic State hierarchy as a person fighting on the ground. So suddenly the equation was, if you can't travel, whether, again, coming back to the point, whether it's money or whatever it is, do this online, get more people involved, make the ecosystem bigger, and you are seen as important a person as with a Kalashnikov on the ground. So I think the challenges that it posed for policy was, India, of course, like in most cases, it woke up very slow to it. But it's not just about India. The fact that policy in most cases lags behind technology by nature, that was the problem. But despite that, India woke up fairly late. So and we still lag in sort of developing systems where you can surveil the internet properly just for these issues without turning it off, for example, and just sort of a general understanding of what Islamic State was doing, whether it be our police or our intelligence. I think it took a lot of time for that to get our heads wrapped around, because it was happening at a furious pace.
Yeah, the rise has been quite dramatic, and suddenly most governments, I think, in the world were quite awestruck by the fact. But in terms of the policy response to it, which governments have done well in terms of getting it relatively right? It's obviously all governments have their own problems, but here when we look at models that different governments have in dealing with radical extremism, in dealing with online extremism, which are some of the models that are interesting to look at in terms of policy, and where India perhaps can still emulate some of those things? Of course, you can't emulate everything.
Right.
But which are some of the interesting models available out there?
I think one sort of area of the world that was particularly struck by this and had the least pragmatic response in the beginning was Europe. So when cases started coming out in their dozens from France or from Belgium, it was suddenly like, wait, this is happening from the Western world. This doesn't make a lot of sense. Supposedly countries that are well assimilated with each other and so on and so forth, because those sort of decades old cracks that are there in society, social fabrics, they were not visible. But this, because of technology, again, bringing these messages to these cracks, allowed these people to suddenly say, fine, I'm going to leave this life in a ghettoized society in Brussels or near Brussels, and I'm going to move to the caliphate. But despite that, I think the best reaction also came from Europe. What Europol specifically created in sort of distribution of intelligence among countries, going beyond the European Union as well, and coming up with questionable but good starts of de-radicalization programs, community approaches, society approaches, going beyond the trigger of a gun, right? You can't defeat this necessarily in Syria on the battlefield, and I think Europe fairly quickly realized that.
But, your book is largely about South Asia, and you talked about Europe, how the conversations, how the fact that they could share information was an effective means. And here you look at the South Asian case, Sri Lankan bombings last year, information flow was a problem, intelligence flow was a problem. So is there more happening in that space in South Asia now? Of course, we know that Pakistan is an outlier here, but other countries, are we looking at a regulatory mechanism perhaps in the region? Or is it still South Asian states are still dealing it primarily on their own, individual states on their own?
I think that's a good question, because that's been our fundamental problem. Most countries on their security, predominantly on issues specifically like Islamic State, tend to deal it as their own concern. There's not enough cohesive action among South Asian states to try and come up with what is a fairly easy topic to sit around for all concerned countries. Islamic State, of course, has its own entity in Afghanistan, right? So ISK is now seen as a sort of leverage against the Taliban. So the Taliban sees ISK as something that they have to fight and hope that the world sort of rallies around them, that they have to defeat Islamic State in Afghanistan. But if you start unraveling it even more, ISK is primarily people who are former Taliban, former TTP, from a Pashtun fighter, so on and so forth. And they only got officiated as a proper Islamic State vilayat last year or last year, while they've been an entity for a couple of years now. So I think a lot of interest in South Asia was largely constituted towards Afghanistan, despite the 2016 case in Dhaka. And I think India has come off mostly as a story of resilience. That, look, despite everything, and you can name everything from local Islamist groups to Pakistan to communal issues, so on and so forth. Despite everything, we have not had more than 155 cases, which is the Home Ministry sort of estimate. And maybe because of this, that the largest country in South Asia did not get that affected, is why we were blindsided with Sri Lanka. And I'll just add to that Sri Lanka is still a very translucent case. It's still not clear whether the Islamic State even knew who these people were, despite their videos of giving bayat to Baghdadi and so on and so forth.
So just to conclude, where do we go from here? I mean, especially in South Asia, do you see this the idea of ISIS still gaining traction, or is the fact that you have the geographical decimation of this entity means that you will gradually see a de-escalation in the situation, in particular in South Asia, where there are enough problems?
I mean, look, we still keep on hearing about these odd cases of arrests of pro-ISIS. I'm really glad that the Indian security establishment now uses pro-ISIS and not ISIS terrorists, because that's just giving precedence to something that doesn't exist. And this has happened multiple times in the past when pro-ISIS cases of people acting in the name of ISIS without ISIS knowing it have committed a crime or a terror act, and they are announced as the new vilayat in India, right? Which is a whole different ballgame altogether. So I think it's still a very strong brand. So even if we see an attack that may not be at scale, but we see an attack committed in the name of ISIS, then ISIS takes responsibility for it, it still creates that same level of terror that Al-Qaeda does, right? So that the scale may not be the same, both geographically of the caliphate. We don't even know who the new caliph is replacing Baghdadi, and just the brand of the Islamic State. So even if something happens today, it will still make the front page, which Indian Mujahideen did not earlier, for example.
So thank you, Kabir. Thank you for coming here, and thank you all for joining us for this wonderful discussion. But just to end this conversation, do you like the name Mr. ISIS, as they
No,
call
I
you?
absolutely do not. Please don't.
We won't call you that. Okay, thank you all. Good night.